you for joining us this evening. My name is Jacqueline Novogratz, and this is Jake Kastner. We are the co-chairs of NY+Acumen.
What is NY+Acumen? NY+Acumen is one of 26 global volunteer-led chapters supporting Acumen's mission to create a world beyond poverty. Through a series of group discussions, events, and online courses, NY+Acumen provides a platform for individuals and groups to share the principles of patient capital, cultivate an understanding of impact investing, and put these ideals into practice in the community. If you're using Twitter for this event, feel free to use hashtag NY+Jacqueline. We may even loop in some of your comments from the Twitterverse into our discussion.
Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that we have quite a few folks from Acumen in the audience today. You can identify them by a name badge with their designation listed. We're making it easy for you, but just so that you get some visuals on them. Can I have the Acumen staff stand up, if you don't mind? Stick up their hands. We want to extend a special thank you to Tomoko Matsukata, who really helped make this event possible. Next, I wanted to have the NY+Acumen chapter members stand up. I wanted to extend a special thanks to Katie Peterson, who dedicated the last couple of months to spearheading this event to make sure it was a reality. Sheila Huang, who put together these beautiful programs and visuals for the event. And Kathy Cow and the whole communications team for getting out the word. I'll let Justice and Dotun introduce the fellows later. I don't want to steal their thunder. That comes in later in the program.
Finally, we wanted to thank Fordham for the opportunity to host this event at this beautiful auditorium. Social innovation has been a key focus of the university, and we're glad we could align on this mission. And now, we'd like to cede the floor to Donna Rapiccioli, Dean of Business Faculty, Dean of the Gabelli School of Business, and Interim Dean of the Graduate School of Business Administration at Fordham University. Too many titles.
I really am delighted to welcome all of you here tonight. As he mentioned, social innovation is part of Fordham's ethos, and what we've been really trying to do is to shine a light on that by bringing speakers that can share their story with our students and our faculty. And in fact, over the summer, all of the freshmen that entered the business school read How to Change the World by David Bornstein, and then he came about 2 weeks ago and shared with them some ideas on how they can change the world. Tonight, I'm really excited to welcome back the Acumen Fund and Jacqueline Novogratz, who came to Fordham back in 2011. I don't know, I think some of the faculty were there. I see Professor Stoner shaking his head yes. And I'll be honest, I hadn't heard of the story, the beautiful book, The Blue Sweater, until then. I read it in anticipation, and I still have it on my table. And that evening, her message of hope and empowerment stuck with me. And honestly, I tried to get her back ever since. And she had an assistant who was wonderful, but really guarded her schedule. So I've really been waiting a long time to welcome you back. So we're delighted that you're here tonight. But I'm also delighted that you're going to listen to these fellows, because each of you in this room has the potential to change the world. Each of you in this room has the potential to help eradicate poverty. So tonight I'm going to encourage you all to listen to the stories and take a moment to reflect. I can almost guarantee that you're all going to go home with ideas. Jot them down, and if you're a Fordham student or an alum, or even if you're not, we're happy to help you bring those ideas along. Because I think that the next fellow can be in this very room. So I encourage you to really push yourself, because together we really can change the world. And together, we can create social innovation. So thank you all for being here at Fordham. It really is a blessing and a grace to have you here, and I look forward to listening to the rest of the speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Donna. Now we would like to get into the main section of tonight's program and introduce Acumen's investments in leadership. There are 3 pillars of Acumen's leadership investments: the Global Fellows Program, the Regional Fellows Program, and the +Acumen Network. Here to talk about the Global Fellows Program, we have 2 members of the Global Fellows class of 2014 to share stories about how they got here and their experience in this past year. Dotun Ayinade and Justice Killian.
Just to offer some brief introductions, Dotun is from Nigeria and has worked for KPMG for the past 4 years, most recently as a senior associate in financial risk management. He holds a bachelor's in microbiology from the Obafemi Awolowo University in Nigeria, and an international certificate in banking risk and regulation. Over the past few months, Dotun has worked in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, at Husk Power Systems. Husk uses innovative biomass technology to convert abundant rice husks into energy to provide power to rural villages. Thanks.
Justice is from the US and has worked as a senior financial analyst at Merrill Lynch and as a global securities technician at the Northern Trust Company. He holds a bachelor's in science and business administration and an MBA from the University of Chicago. He also is a CFA charter holder. Over the past few months, Justice worked in Kulu, Uganda, with Kulu Agricultural Development Company, GADC, which provides market access to smallholder farmers in northern Uganda.
Thank you guys for the introduction, and it's really a pleasure to be here and speak with you tonight about our experience. So Dotun and I have just returned from about 9 months in the field, working with investee companies. So like you were introduced at GADC in northern Uganda.
And I work with Husk Power Systems in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania.
So we want to give you a brief introduction into the Fellows Program and kind of tell you about the structure, and then open it up to show you where everybody, there's a lot of fellows in the audience, so we'll draw attention to them. But Dotun, where did this all start for you? How did you get here?
Interesting question. So the journey began for me with back there in Lagos. I used to work with KPMG. I guess I would say the greatest influence was the Acumen Fellow in the class of 2013 by the name Mustafa Abukile. Mustafa and I were colleagues back then at KPMG, and then he told me one of the best guys in the unit. So he told me he was resigning to take up the position on the Global Fellows Program, and I was sort of shocked because he was slated for a double promotion that year, and it sort of piqued my interest in the Acumen investment model and the Global Fellows Program in general. So I started to read about, and luckily I found Jacqueline Novogratz's book, The Blue Sweater.
If you don't have it, get it.
I sort of resonated with the ideas in the book, particularly at the point when I was in college. I was considering either moving into development, and I saw these ideas in the book talking about businesses at the intersection of development and business. So the rest is same.
Yeah.
So Justus, how was the experience like for you, especially the interview process? Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so the interview process is quite long. I remember the in-person interviews being out in San Francisco, and one of the alumni who did remote was on the interview panel. He asked me, "What does a world beyond poverty look like?" I was like, how do you even answer something like that? Where do I even begin? And what I found is coming on board with Acumen and their leadership program, it's really giving me the tools to answer a question like that. So it's not only the financial and operational perspectives that they offer, but it's also moral imagination.
Yeah, speaking of moral imagination, to come across to folks in the audience as just one of those Acumen speakers, but it's an essential part of Acumen's leadership work. So talking about moral imagination, the way Acumen views leadership in general is actually along the lines of empathy. A leader having a deep sense of self-awareness, and then most importantly, capacity, the audacity to take risk and not be afraid of failure. So that's an interesting aspect of the leadership work, moral imagination.
And that, for me, was probably one of the most powerful tools that I took going into Uganda. I was living up by the South Sudan border. I had a team of about 60 buyers that were working with me, and we were buying sesame. Throughout the season, these guys have been financed with a lot of capital. We've been working directly with the farmers, and we get to the end of the season and we're counting all of the inventory, and it's not matching up. It turns out that one of our store managers and a couple of our top buyers that I work very closely with had been double counting and basically stealing from the company.
Yeah, just so I remember you talked about that during the media retreat in Nairobi. You shared the experience of how the two key staff had colluded to pull off a huge fraud.
Yeah.
And
And that was really challenging. I mean, I felt betrayed, and the cohort and the space gave me time to really look at the situation and think about it in a kind of broader narrative. So it wasn't just this abuse of trust. It was also working in a post-conflict region, and it was also the systems that the company had built that created this. So it gave me the perspective that in working in this sector, we can't jump to conclusions. It's usually a lot deeper than we really think. So, Platoon, I know you also have a really interesting story from Tanzania perspective.
yeah, thankfully my experience was more positive, but like just a story of fraud and corruption. I had a positive experience in Tanzania. The interesting thing about the Global Fellows Program is the power it has in changing your perspective. You come into the program with lots of notions about poverty, about how the poor, their buying power, their economic power. And then I had like a very shocking episode, shockingly in a positive way. So I was on the solar survey in the southern parts of Tanzania in some remote village without any grid infrastructure. So guess what I saw? A large satellite dish in front of a mud house. I mean, it's finding such huge contraption in front of a mud house, in an area without any grid infrastructure was definitely shocking for me. So I was curious and I decided to look further to find out, how a satellite dish, something you find in big cities, find it going to some remote village in Tanzania. And I pressed further, I knocked in front of the door, and surprisingly, a great man in his 60s, came out, and so he was very excited to talk about, the satellite dish, and particularly how he managed to bring it from the city to the rural area and to the remote village. And he decided to talk, and he went into his bedroom. I was a bit surprised. And right there in his bedroom, I could see he had a small solar DC TV. Apparently, he was a huge fan of football, and he was such that he needed a solar DC TV to watch football matches of his favorite clubs. That was very interesting for me because I pressed further and realized that the solar company in that neighborhood that was providing the facility for a monthly installment, the man was actually paying regularly and he wasn't falling behind on installmental payments. It sort of changed my perspective. Here was I coming into the environment thinking that the basic needs of the folks in the environment in that particular locality would be just lighting and mobile charging, and getting to realize that folks in that area actually have deep aspirations to own gadgets like they all do in the city, and also the fact that they could actually pay for those things. So it was quite an experience, learning about the aspirations of the poor and the fact that they could also make sure.
And that's a powerful insight. Now that we have returned from the field, so there's 12 of us in total, we're working with the portfolio team and sitting with Jacqueline and taking time to reflect and really try to understand these insights and see where the sector is at and if there's key ideas that we can bring together to help move these companies forward. So it's a great time at the end to kind of have self-reflection, I just realized that we did not move the slide.
Speaking of self-reflection, I think it's time to, it's just fair and apt to recall the line from the offer letter we got about a little over a year ago when we signed up for the fellowship. A line from Jacqueline about how the year would stretch us to our limits, how to challenge our assumptions, and of course the fact that it will push us out of our comfort zone. I'm sure Justus and I and all the fellows from the outgoing class of 2014 will agree that the last couple of months have been one that has challenged our assumptions, that has pushed us out of our comfort zone, and of course the year has made us better for it.
It's very true.
It's appropriate at this point to recognize folks from the outgoing class of 2014. If you are here, just welcome with a wave of hand. Yeah, you can stand up. And we have folks from the class of 2015, I beg your pardon. If you're here, please wave and let's see the class of 2015. Do we have anyone from the alumni community in the space?
Mario back there.
Oh, Mario. Interestingly, Mario was our hospital assistant. Thank you, Mario.
So we'd love to continue these conversations. If you have any questions about our various field placements or just Acumen in general, so please feel free to grab any one of us and we'd love to chat. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stoughton and Justice. And now on to the main feature of tonight. I'd like to say Jacqueline Novogratz is a woman who needs no introduction, but we'll go ahead and do a quick introduction here. Jacqueline Novogratz is the CEO and founder of Acumen, author of The Blue Sweater, and an inspired TED speaker. Prior to Acumen, Jacqueline founded and directed the Philanthropy Network and the Next Generation Leadership programs at the Rockefeller Foundation. She also co-founded Dutarindere, a microfinance institution in Rwanda. She began her career in international banking with Chase Manhattan Bank. Jacqueline currently sits on the advisory board of the Sonian Capital and the Harvard Business School Social Enterprise Initiative. She serves on the Aspen Institute Board of Trustees and board of IDEO.org, and is member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the World Economic Forum Global Agenda Council for Sustainable Development. Ladies and gentlemen, Jacqueline Novogratz. So as a quick introduction to this section of the program, Nikita and myself. Nikita is another chapter leader. Nikita Raghunath is the chair of volunteer engagement at NY+Acumen. We're going to be in conversation with Jacqueline for a few minutes, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. So if you just bear with us, I will quickly define why we chose tonight's theme, and that can help set some context and serve as a springboard for the Q&A tonight. So we define impact-driven leadership as leadership with a focus on social impact first. In the same light that impact investing is investing with a focus on impact first. We chose the theme of investing in impact-driven leadership because in a sense that is what Acumen is doing with the Fellows Program, the leaders of portfolio companies, and our own +Acumen network, the NY+Acumen chapter included. So, given that, Jacqueline, you're an entrepreneur at heart. You started Rwanda's first microfinance organization. You started Acumen to address poverty in a completely unique way through venture philanthropy. What does impact-driven leadership mean to you? And following that, what are the key traits, what do you think are the key traits for a person who lives an impact-driven life?
Good, easy start. Thanks. Before I answer those, Sean, I just want to thank you and Nikita and all the organizers for tonight. The whole chapter phenomenon has been just extraordinary to see, and I think it so speaks to a sort of yearning that your generation has to really make change in the world, and so that's really thrilling. And I also just want to thank you, Dean Lovejoy. I'm embarrassed that you've never gotten through my assistant. They are good. But when I was lucky enough to come to Fordham before, the ethos of this university really sits at the heart of impact. And certainly Jesuit principles of, essentially, I think there's a line that says something like, you have to find where your deepest yearning meets the world's greatest need. And in a way, there's probably no better phrase to encapsulate what impact urban leadership is all about. That so many people confuse means and ends. And so they think the end is in the impact investing sphere. So what are your returns? And I can't tell you how many times I sit with potential investors and donors, and as soon as they hear that we invest, they want to talk about what kind of returns, what are the trade-offs, rather than how do we think about investment as a means to the end of creating real change in the world. I would say the same thing goes with people who want to follow lives of passion or purpose, and they sit and try to focus on, if I just knew what my passion was, I could really make change, rather than how do I find skills that help me be interested in the world, that learn about the world, how do I find leaders that will teach me, and through that come on to my passion. Same thing goes with title. People think, if I could only be the CEO or the director of impact or run this division, then I could be an impact-driven leader, rather than some of the stories that Adedotum and Justice just told. That it actually doesn't matter where you are, both in which sector you're in, whether it's corporate or governance or impact investing, the nonprofit sector. Rather, how am I helping others get more successful? How am I bringing integrity to this? Through those often courageous ways of being within organization, I think you end up creating more impact than if you wait around for it perfect to call it impact at large. In terms of some of the characteristics, in some ways I've gotten to a few of them, but I would say it starts with having the courage to hold opposable truths. At Acumen, we talk about values and intention. We talk about having the humility to see the world as it is and the audacity to imagine it as it could be. I would add to that the guts and the perseverance and the determination to get stuff done. We talk about really being a listener, but sometimes having to take the hard decision even though you don't have the right means and leading. We talk about being generous, but also being accountable. And I would add that when we started, I really thought this word patient capital would try to slow down a crazy world that was measuring itself only quantitatively on a quarterly basis. But I would add that we need to be both patient and urgent. And we live in a world that wants simplicity. We want to know who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. We look at ISIS today. This is a 12, if not 15-sided problem that is not going to be solved with a single solution. All of the problems that are worth solving are so complex that we need to have the courage to look at it from many different angles and then understand what tool you may be using at any given time, but then having the humility to ask and find flexibility in bringing other tools to bring about that impact.
Great. That was sorry.
I'm talking you up.
you mentioned courage, you mentioned complexity, you mentioned the ability to listen, but also the ability to make a decision at the right time. When there's so much ambiguity. Can you talk a little bit more about your experience with that particular aspect of leadership, courage? And I feel like courage is such a key aspect of leadership. If you could tell us any stories from the field of fellows, of portfolio companies where you've seen courage really exhibited in the greatest light possible. And
Yeah, I want to talk about courage in small ways and big ways, if that's okay, because I think that we underrate how important it is to have courage, often on a daily basis. And one of the things I think about a lot with your generation is you're all taught to be such overachievers and so perfect that it actually takes courage to risk being imperfect. It takes courage to risk being the person that holds their hand up and says, I actually don't think this is the right answer. And so I don't want to underestimate what that takes. And there was a moment in Acumen where I would say that we became a culture that was too nice, that we were so invested in each other's success that we did not only ourselves a disservice, but we did the poor a disservice because we weren't really taking each other on. And so we had to get courage to make some big cultural changes inside the organization. Today, and I didn't get permission from the fellows to call you guys out, but I'm gonna do it anyway, so I hope that's okay. But I was really struck by many of the acts of courage that some of our fellows talked about. And it's, again, when people think that they're going to go and change the world, the image is, one, that you personally are going to have huge impact in the first couple of months, and mostly all you do is cry and feel confused. It's just kind of like part of the deal. But two, particularly with Acumen, because we tell these stories about these incredible people and this incredible change, you feel that you're going to be in the field, wearing khaki pants, hanging out with really poor people, and like watching them transform in front of you. And then we like put you in a back office in an accounting system, like Ujjati. And it's very confusing because it's like, wait, I left the corporate world so I could go like hold kids and play. And I joined Acumen and they're like making me do spreadsheets. The courage is then in finding within that this idea that where are your strengths meeting the world's need? And can you do it in a way that brings joy to it, that brings efficacy to it, that brings other people with you? And I think that's courage. And when Justice talked about finding fraud and feeling betrayed, that's about hurt. That's about questioning yourself and things that you believe in. What he didn't tell you about is that he had to get these young people who he adored and felt personally invested in arrested. That's courage. And what we talk about at Acumen is doing what's right, not what's easy. In my job, now 13 years into it, 90 entrepreneurs, 300 fellows, and goodness knows how many team members, I've been able to see the little and the big. One entrepreneur who has really made an impact on all of us at Acumen is a young Pakistani American named Javad Aslam. And his first act of courage was after 9/11, deciding that while he didn't really know Pakistan as a country, it was the country of his heritage, and he wanted to go and see how he could make a difference. And though he didn't speak very good Punjabi, his second act of courage was to go to this village outside of Lahore. We connected him to an amazing entrepreneur named Tasneem Siddiqui, who was irascible and curmudgeonly and the real deal. And so he wasn't an easy guy to latch onto, but Javad had the courage not only to latch, but to hang onto his every word. And then when he started to build his house, and I told this story in the book, the housing development, he wouldn't pay any bribes. The courage wasn't in the righteousness of not paying a bribe. The courage was in, again, overcoming ego. Because ego would have said, if I pay a bribe, at least I get this done because I've left this big job. And now, 18 months into it, after I told the whole world that I'm going to build a housing development in Pakistan, I haven't even put my spade in the ground. That was the courage. Was looking not so smart, looking not so effective, looking not so anything in front of his peers, his donors, his fellow fellows. And I've watched that man now grow into a real leader. Now we've been working together for 12 years. And while he still doesn't have millions of housing units, which is what so often the venture world wants him to have, he's got hundreds of housing units. He's building thousands now of housing units. But Behera, one of our fellows, said today, Acumen doesn't always solve the poverty gap, but it is solving the hope gap. And when I look at Javad, that one, he stands as a role model that is just extraordinary, not only inside Pakistan, but around the world. Two, he really does what's right, not what's easy. He cares not just about the why, but he cares about the how in the most profound ways. Three, he brings people along with him, and he practices what he preaches. He actually built himself a home and moved into this housing development, which even some of the tenants told me, I'm a city dweller. What am I doing in this place? There are no resources for me. And I was like, well, we were one of the poor that we were trying to get housing for. And they're like, yeah, but if I had a pharmacy, I'd be a lot happier. It's like, good point, that this guy moved himself there. That's courage. And so I could go on for hours on the issue of courage, but I think that too often we think about it, like courage in big titled letters, rather than are we challenging ourselves every day to do the right thing, do the hard thing, move outside our comfort zone.
Well, yeah, it seems even the small acts are just small acts of courage. I guess that's where the phrase comes from these days. So I know that one of the most powerful messages in Acumen's manifesto is the idea of creating hope. And you mentioned hope, how Jawad created this hope in the situation he was in Pakistan. In a sense, hope is an irrational emotion, but a wonderful panacea for the suffering present in a lot of the human condition. A reason for us to go on despite the odds. It's something that keeps us going. I was curious in terms of how you view this balance between having this really boundless optimism. It's almost like realistic optimism is how I see you defining hope. And how you balance that with all of the moral complexities that you see that the fellows have had to deal with, that justice had to deal with in Uganda, that Jawad had to deal with in Pakistan, that many other people within Acumen's network have had to deal with. How do you keep yourself going with that hope? And how do we learn from that, frankly? Like, I wish I had that boundless hope like you.
I think you probably do, or you wouldn't be sitting here.
There you go.
I think, it's trite to say hope is not a strategy. I think that hope that just sits in the light is naive and too facile and ends up in a funny way just shriveling. We talked a lot today, I was only with the fellows for about an hour and a half, which is never long enough, but we talked about failure, we talked about the dark. And I don't think you can understand what the light is unless you understand the dark. And that means not only failing, but seeing and having the moral imagination to understand other people's failures. And like all of the fellows, and as you say, Sean, I've been betrayed and at times felt trampled on and hurt. And yet, at each of those moments, you kind of have a choice. You can decide then that everybody's like this, even though 99% 99% of your life experience shows you that indeed everybody's not. Or you can decide that, all right, so this was a little bump. Most of the world wants to make change. Most of the world wants agency. Most of the world wants to be seen, wants to love, wants to be loved, as Aristotle said, is aspirational. And so, if you can move into that place, but recognize the ugly truths, not only do you get stuff done, but I think you start to really see the human journey in much more spectacular ways. Probably the most stark example of almost moral bracketing and ugly compromise that I've seen happened in the Kibera slum, which is in Nairobi. It's a huge slum, it's one of the biggest slums in the world. And it's actually connected to Blue Sweater because there's a secondhand clothing market in it. The secondhand clothing market had about 2,000 stalls. So about 100,000 people depended directly on this clothing market, which was really the economic engine of the whole slum. In 2008, in the elections when there were those riots in the slums, 200 boys from one particular ethnic group burned down the market, razed it to the ground, killed people, destroyed everything inside. I happened to go there about a week after the market was burned down and literally saw those boys starting to stake territory and saw a guy get macheted. So the violence was really serious. Well, there were 3 heroes in a whole mass of people that had no idea what to do. Because the truth was, the cops weren't going in. The courts had no place to deal with this. The international NGOs were not walking into those slums. And the community was totally divided. You had Luos on one side and Kikuyus on the others, and everybody was afraid of each other. So the 3 heroes of the story are one, Ingrid Monroe, who was a Swedish activist who started a community-based membership organization called Johnny Bora that had 80,000 members were connected somehow to this market. So she knew that come hell or high water, they needed to rebuild this market. And then she had her 2 lieutenants who were just unbelievable, a guy named Andrew Luo and a guy named Gabriel Kadidi Kikuyu. And Andrew decided that with Ingrid, they decided that the only way they could negotiate taking back the market and getting it rebuilt, because the international community had pretty much left them high and dry, was to get the boys themselves that had attacked and destroyed the market, 1, to rebuild it, and 2, they had to somehow share part of that market with them. And so they negotiated with an intertribal committee that they would pay the guys a fairly great wage to rebuild the market, and 2, they gave each of the 200 young men a stall. And from a pure moral perspective, that's a pretty uncomfortable decision to make, that you've actually rewarded the perpetrators, and that they then will be working amidst the victims and the survivors. And yet, they were backed against the wall. They knew that the only way to bring this community back was to get this market going. And so that's what they did. And they actually got that market rebuilt within 3 weeks, which is just shocking. And I brought the board, the Acumen board there, less than a year later, and it wasn't fully comfortable. But it was functional, the community came back, and today, if you went there, you wouldn't even know this story had happened, although the people who operate there obviously do. To me, it's that kind of ability to look at the ugly truth, to still navigate it, and to recognize that there are heroes in the world that have 50 times more courage than we'll ever have in our lives. And we get to find a way to stand by them, learn from them, support them. What a way to live.
I want to touch more on the concept of failure and have sort of 3 questions. So first, how did the early challenges you faced with Acumen sort of shape the organization as it is today? Second, given that you operate around the board and working with investors and founders who have all sorts of experiences, how do you deal with different concepts of failure and help these entrepreneurs cope with that? And third, how have their experiences in turn shaped Acumen's notions of what to do around that?
Great. So some of the early decisions, I would say, probably the most important that we started right from the beginning was something that we called the forced ranking. And so we would rank our investments from best to worst from an impact basis. And what was interesting is that led us to the recognition that if we didn't have sustainable, profitable companies, we would never have impact. And so we knew that we had to hold this dichotomy very clearly as well. That shifted the culture from traditional, I would say particularly just traditional foundations, because you moved away from the politics of seeing who could advocate for their company and who could have the biggest budget, to who was telling the truth about what worked and what didn't work. And so that we started rewarding people internally for doing the right thing. And I think that has really been something that we've tried to hold at Acumen. Again, I would say that when you look at how organizations grow and change, then you get to a place though that you recognize how hard the work is and how much people are trying. But then we got too nice, and then we had to institute what the military calls an after-action review. And so now we look at whether it's a meeting that went wrong, sometimes went right, but usually went wrong, or a company that failed. We do what the military does, and really no holds barred, talked about what worked, what didn't work, how we could do it better. And Carlisle Singer, our COO, who's been with us for the last year and a half, has really been pushing this idea in a very powerful way of getting the person who made the investment to take responsibility to sit with the team and talk about why it was a colossal disaster. And that's not easy to do, because you love these entrepreneurs, you love these companies. And so that's been, I'd say, the next iteration that has moved forward. It's a really insightful question to ask about failure culturally. We were talking about it as well today. That in the United States we have a culture where, particularly Silicon Valley, failing is part of the deal. You fail fast, you iterate, you repeat, you learn, you fail again, you iterate, you repeat, you learn. And but in many of the cultures in which we operate, that's not always allowed. And we're actually hoping that with our fellows who come from all around the world that we start to shift that. And our regional programs, which include a real diversity of people from the MBAs trained in the best schools of the world to people who grew up in the tribal areas or slums, to force a conversation where they get to know and see each other and push each other. We talk a lot about failure there, and we ask the teams there to talk about failure. And when you start to imagine not just the 300 fellows that we have around the world now, but 1,000 fellows around the world, I hope, back to your piece, that we can start modeling what kind of global conversation we need to have around what actually needs to be done, to be had to create real solutions to problems across lines of difference. Because if there's a single skill set that we need to develop, and it comes right out of our imagination, it is this ability to talk to each other across lines of difference, to admit failure, to learn from the other, and not to be so tribal and often religious, whether it is about religion, or it is about market fundamentalism, or it is about democracy. We are now in a very complex moment in history where we've got to talk about failure, talk about not having all the answers, and find ways to not only collaborate and build those answers together, but to make course corrections along the way as we go. And we don't have a lot of leaders yet that are doing that, but it's certainly my hope that your generation becomes those leaders. And to what Donna talked about before, that you really start exercising new sets of muscles that my generation didn't do such a good job exercising.
I agree. It's completely. It's amazing how people talk about failure around the world. And just going to Asia, for example, where some of my parents are from, the whole idea of even talking about failure is forbidden, essentially. It's either you talk about success or it's something that's not even talked about. So.
Well, can I jump in there?
Yeah.
The one thing though is, it's amazing to me that if you show your own humanity, how much it opens a door to let other people show their humanity. And probably the most delightful aspect of my book, which I was not suspecting, was the number of individuals from all around the world, including people from slums, who would write or text me, thank you for writing the book. I'm just like you because, like you, I also have been a failure. And thank you for giving me permission to fail and know that at some point I might also succeed. And the two big lessons for me was, one, the arrogance that I had in thinking that low-income people from slums were going to relate to low-income people from slums in my book. But that is not who they related to. They related to me as an protagonist that wanted to bridge the gap between rich and poor and kept trying different ways that didn't work. They related to that. And it gave them permission then to talk to me about their failures. And so I think that once we start shifting and create a culture where we are allowed to, and in fact are encouraged to talk about failure, not in a despondent, unhopeful way, but and this is what I learned from it, way, I think we might be able to shift. We have to shift.
You mentioned that what our generation could learn from this whole notion of failure, and how we could actually start to make it more of a constructive mechanism in how we think about complex societal problems around the world. I wanted to shift attention back to the U.S., and I think you talk often about income inequality in the U.S., how it's such a dire problem within our own country. Acumen's focus is obviously around the world. It's in Asia, it's in Africa, it's in South America. But just a few days ago, minimum wage workers protested for livable wage hikes across the nation. San Francisco and even our town of New York are seeing rising housing prices, pushing people out, original inhabitants out of the city. The problem doesn't appear to be going away anytime soon.
No.
How do our generation, how do the people in the audience, how do young leaders across the country engage with these issues, given what you've learned through Acumen, through the Fellows Program, through your entire experience working in Rwanda, working at Acumen, working at the Rockefeller Foundation? I guess what are some of the key lessons you've learned there that could be applicable to our generation and how we can tackle this complex societal problem?
It's another great question. Well, first I should tell you that we are quietly exploring Acumen America for the reasons of that you talked about, and also because we started Acumen to change the way the world tackles poverty, and I don't think the world really understands what poverty is, and it's really fascinating to me when I am in Africa or South Asia to hear people say two things. One, on one hand, how come you're helping over here but you're not working in your own country, which is legitimate? But two, which is a complete contradiction, people in the United States are rich, even poor people have air conditioners and cars, and the people here are poor. And within that is a real need in this country. Obviously, this is a country where 25% of our children go to bed hungry every night. That is immoral, that is dangerous, that's not good for anybody. And so, for Acumen, some of the areas that we're seeing real need and real opportunity, and this is something for you all to think about as well, one is in financial inclusion. because you're seeing so many people only able to access credit from loan sharks and payday places. And so I wrote a paper in 1991 saying microfinance wasn't necessarily a job creator anywhere in the world, and certainly not in the United States. And now I would look differently at what's happening in this country. Two is in health services. And some of the most interesting things that we're seeing, ideas, are around looking at Obamacare and ways that we can keep people out of hospital, and then finding business models that then reward the businesses for reducing government payment. That, I feel, is really an exciting opportunity. We haven't seen a lot of examples of it, but the construct makes a whole ton of sense there. The third area I'm spacing on, but it may come back to me. And so, and no, I'm not going to go there. I always get myself in trouble. But when I think about all the lessons of my life, I would say, and I just was in Latin America where you have a similar dichotomy of very, very wealthy and very, very poor, is we underestimate the power of what I would call accompaniment. That what so many people need is, for lack of a better word, agency, the ability to believe in themselves. Someone that says, come on, you can do it. And these are not difficult things. And so I would start by trying to do moral imagination practices, really learn. We have something at Acumen that we call Everyday Barriers exercise, where we send team members and fellows off into the outer reaches of the boroughs or whatever cities they live in with no money and a Metro card and no cell phone, and their job is to come back and tell us how they would redefine city services from the perspective of low-income people. You learn so much about the situation when you actually go and experience it. Not pretend that you're poor, but just be in it. Spend a day at soup kitchens. Small steps in terms of taking on mentoring, whether it's within a homeless organization or starting a social enterprise where you see an opportunity. When I look at our entrepreneurs, and I look at Mario back there, one of the fellows from, how many years ago? 3? 4. You don't wake up in the morning and say, this is a problem I want to solve. You stumble upon these problems. And Mario decided that he was really going to focus on young women in Southeast Asia and look at ways both to provide them access to education in a financially sustainable way, but also to mentoring. And it has been thrilling to watch over these 4 years that organization really grow. Sam Goldman of D-Light didn't start by wanting to solve the solar problem. He was a Peace Corps volunteer. And then next door to him, a hurricane lamp fell over and the house burned down. And he said, I just took it for granted that this is what an African village looked like and felt like, but actually, how can we live in a world where 1.5 billion people are totally dependent on this really lousy energy source? And started D-Lighting. And so my call to action for you all is to start taking steps outside your comfort zone and get involved in, whether it's organizations or just with people, to learn about the real issues from the ground up, and hopefully stumble across something and decide that this is what you want to learn more about, work on, and who knows, it might be your life's work.
As a healthcare entrepreneur, I can definitely relate to that idea of just jumping off and really understanding what you want to do, asking the right questions, seeing opportunity where there is opportunity. So definitely appreciate that perspective, and I hope that on the topic of questions, I wanted to see if anybody from the audience had any questions. We're going to start the Q&A section of tonight's talk. We wanted to open up the last 20 to 30 minutes of tonight's program. So if everybody could line up on either the left or right side. I think we'll just take questions as they come. So we can also have people raise their hands if we want. We're trying to find some microphones, but I think for now it's either line up on the left or right side, or we will have you raise your hand.
I have a solution for the microphone if you can't project your voice. Come up and speak at the podium.
Okay, yeah, come up and speak at the podium. No pressure.
Yeah, I can hear you.
I can project. So you kind of spoke to the slum situation where they rebuilt the market. That kind of spoke to me because I think of that as a greater good decision. As a military member, I've seen those go poorly as well as well. I guess, how do you navigate those situations from your perspective? I mean, obviously they can go a lot of different directions, and you're kind of, you could do a lot of harm in that situation. It could be perceived as something unethical, and that could very much undermine your work. So it's interesting, like, how do you go about making a decision to make a greater good decision in that situation?
It's a great question. And every situation is different, and it's really why we need to build leaders and not manuals, because there is no manual. In this situation, we didn't fund, we weren't part of the funding. We had supported John Bora, so we didn't have to make a decision, quite frankly. I did try to find them funding, though, personally, because I thought these guys were they didn't need investment. They needed a grant, and they needed one fast. So I called everybody I knew. What motivated me was that this was not a solution that outsiders came and imposed on the community. But this was an intertribal solution from two people who lived and knew and were the first responders to that community. And so I trusted the leaders there. It was very uncomfortable. Even listening to the story was uncomfortable. And yet, I couldn't think of any other move other than having lived and worked in developing communities around the world, including in Harlem. I knew that the politics were going to be so corrosive that nothing was ever going to get done. And so took a bet on the right leaders. And these guys were so courageous that John and Bernard, the leaders of the gang, came to Andrew, each with machetes to kill him. And he stood there and said, you killed me, there are a million guys like me behind me. And somehow, just with his force of integrity, these guys were like, looked at each other, and this went on for days. And I said, John, where did you get that moral courage? And this is a guy that lives in the slum. And he said, I really did believe that if they killed me, there would be a lot of people behind me. But if someone didn't stand up and do what was right, this community was going to go up in smoke, and I couldn't let that happen. So, for me, it's betting on the leader, looking at, is this local ownership, or is this imposed from, we know what's right for you, with certainty. These guys shared their fear, and it was, you're against the wall, I'm going to call everybody I know to help you. So, could have been the wrong decision. Yeah.
Yeah, are you stand up?
Sure. Metrics may not be quite the same in the private sector as they are in the social sector, but you must still have them so that you know if you are succeeding and improving. How do you think about metrics both for your own organization and for the companies that you fund? And are there consequences for not meeting certain types of metrics?
Yes.
Jacqueline, can you repeat the question, please?
So the question is on metrics. How do we think about metrics? How do we look at metrics for Acumen and for the world? Are there consequences if you do not meet the metrics? The metrics that Acumen is using are really to look at three aspects around poverty within a company. One is the breadth, the number of people that are impacted by a certain investment. So Malaria bednet company, employed 8,000 people, makes 30 million nets a year, impacts up to 60 million people. Huge on breadth. The second is depth. How is this investment actually impacting a person's ability to actually move out of poverty? So Javad and housing, huge on depth. You actually see people's livelihoods change, their agency change. Gulu, I would say as well, big on depth, which is where justice worked. The third is poverty. Because when you hear people talk about impact investing, often they're talking about a whole spectrum. Some are just focused on environmental issues. Some that we've looked at are actually serving people that make $10 a day per individual within a family. And so we would say that doesn't meet our poverty focus. So we actually look at how many people are being served that are living under the poverty line or within 2x poverty line. And so that's the poverty focus. So that we can start to really ask ourselves the hard questions as to where our investment support is making the greatest difference. We obviously also look at financial metrics because it's so important that these companies are profitable and that they grow. In terms of the overall metric for Acumen, success for us is the number of profitable companies that are serving at scale. So we are looking for companies that either by themselves or through replication are reaching millions of people and creating models for change. Are there consequences if people do not? Yes, it's tricky. The easiest consequence, which is a metric that we don't quantify, is corruption. We find corruption, we find ways to exit ourselves from the deal. It's a lot harder than we thought it would be, but it's something that we're committed to. When we find that companies are not reaching their target group, which is tantamount to failure, we also look at exiting from the deal. And there have been a number of companies that start off in the middle class and their desire is to go lower. It's one of the hardest things that we've seen companies try to do, because to have the will to go down market when you have the crushing reality of needing to be profitable. When you started at profitability and a middle class product line, I can't think of a single instance where that's been successful. And so we look at that as well.
Back there in the black cup. Yeah, too. Blue cup.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I just wanted to ask a question on government leadership. And I mean, Mark just talked about from the business impact, which is amazing and what we're doing. But then there's an issue where leaders really matter, and they matter also in government. The government, at the end of the day, has the sole responsibility to destroy things that actually happen. And you can see what Kagame has done in Rwanda, while my president in Uganda is the opposite, and they were actually leading together for Kagame to over. So what's the role of government in ensuring that businesses actually grow and really fight poverty and creating that conducive environment?
It's a critical question. The question was, what's the role of government? And looking at President Kagame in Rwanda, who has been very successful in creating clear rules of the road, and President Museveni in Uganda, who has been less successful in creating those rules. The big game ultimately has to be around the government creating systems that allow people to work within the rules and understand what those rules are. Capitalism does not work without trust. And that's something we don't think about enough, and it's something that we don't talk about enough. And so one of the hard realities that we had to confront is that we thought if we saw corruption, we could go to the courts. Well, if the courts don't really matter, again, you don't have a lot of tools at your disposal. And if you just say, well, we're going to write off, in defiance, investments that we've made in companies where we found corruption, well, then you get a reputation that all you have to do is show them that you've done something wrong, and they're going to let go of that $1 million loan they just made. So you can't do that either. So this goes back again to, can we build models and can we find a way to create not only hope, but a sense of accountability? And that's going to take all of us to create that kind of change. it meant that strategically, as we looked at particularly our regional fellows, that we would bring government officials into the regional fellows group so that you were building a cohort that began to have the hard conversation, learn to understand and trust one another, and take a long-term view to doing that. In some companies, the only way that they can scale is to partner with government, and that was a big conversation as well for Acumen. How do you make the decision to do that? And what you find is that governments aren't corrupt. Individuals within government are corrupt. And not only that, it is too facile and it's disrespectful to say we're working in corrupt countries because it takes two to tango. And if you look at corruption in the oil industry in Nigeria, well, there's some company on the other end, probably not a Nigerian running it, who is paying off the bribes to the Nigerian minister so that we can get oil in the way that we want in Nigeria. So these are very complicated issues, and for us at Acumen, where it gets important for us to be investors that can stand and hold our head held high as investors and really build companies that matter. Have examples like our ambulance companies in Kitsa that would have been a great private sector company if it didn't partner with government. By partnering with government now across 5 states in India, it serves 200 million people in India. And what I have learned from it is two things. One is that this development trajectory is almost an organic process. You have to push the inevitable, and that's what Acumen is trying to do. But we see these patterns in all countries, including the United States. When Kea on my team has been reading this book, because these are the kind of books we read at Acumen on the history of ambulances. It's really for a great late time reading. But when I was asking, what happened? What was the history in the U.S.? Because now we've seen an ambulance company, the 9 ambulances, get to a point where it served 200 million people. In the United States, ambulances were also fully privatized, and until the 1960s. The conventional wisdom was the difference between an ambulance and a hearse was whether you had a cot or a coffin in the back of your car. The reason ambulances became a public good was during the Cold War, presidents, well, really Truman, Eisenhower, up through Johnson, recognized the vulnerability the United States faced from a nuclear bomb, and that we had no emergency response. The ambulance system and it wasn't really until the end of the 60s that we had full government partnership and regulation. That's when you started seeing what we have in the United States today. In India, we saw the same thing. Fully broken, bloated, corrupt industry. The terrorist attacks of Mumbai a few years ago flipped that. Government saw that this private company was the first responder and they otherwise had no response. And now you're seeing partnership. What I didn't understand is that once you could scale a single company, not only could you deliver services, but that when you go and talk to the low-income people who are getting ambulance services for the first time in their lives, and in any generation lives, in their family, they don't only expect the ambulance to come, but for the first time they're not expected to pay a bribe. And that is a behavioral shift that goes back to your whole question. You can go through a lot of hard stuff if that's the end of the story. And in some ways, it's just the beginning. So yes, it's important. It's actually the end game. We need rules of the road that everybody can play in. We need to build trust. There are a lot of ways to do it. Our one way, which is not the only way, is to build those companies that matter, that serve the poor in ethical ways, that create examples so we can help government look good.
All the way in the back. Yeah, dude.
So you talked a lot about how we, empower the change. I was wondering if you could talk about a little bit of the due diligence process that you guys have, not only just from a quantitative perspective, but particularly from how do you identify who's not really on the ground there that will be an effective leader or before a fellow comes in and after.
So due diligence for the fellows.
No,
for the entrepreneurs. I think a big lesson for us at Acumen, again, when you think about our own trajectory, in the beginning when we were a tiny team, we focused on almost only on the entrepreneur. And we looked at three things: their ability to inspire a vision that would bring other people along, that they were really thinking big. Particularly 13 years ago, we would find people in the social sector who really thought small. They thought that I could just work in this village, that's good enough. And it was really hard to find those people who could actually imagine what it would take to build a company that would serve a million people. Second, they had to have a business plan that was convincing that they would actually get there. Sustainability, and I would say at the very beginning we focused much more on full private sector sustainability. Now we look at other roads, other government partnerships and other ways for them to build a profitable company. And third and most important was their ethical fiber. Were they people that we believed would do the right thing? Did they have the determination to keep getting up, the courage to fail and then get up again? And mostly we have succeeded. Now, as these companies grow, obviously we spend more time also really understanding the fundamentals of their market. And importantly, do they understand the market? I can't tell you how many times MBAs from some of the best schools in this country have come to Acumen with really great technologies and innovations, but have no understanding of how poor people make decisions, have not really been in and of community. And we've learned a few really important things. One is that innovation is overrated. Show me that you've got practical wisdom, that you're a listener, that you actually know how to build stuff. Goes a lot further. Two, that the idea of build it and they will come is a big fat lie when you're talking about markets for the poor. You build it and most people just look at it. They don't trust you. They probably think it's a really stupid idea at the beginning. Are you someone who knows how to tell stories and find ways to understand how those people make decisions so that you can actually build with them and for them? And then finally, the biggest piece now that I've learned is, when you make an investment in an entrepreneur, you better be thinking as much as you would think about marrying someone, because you essentially do. We invested in someone for 10 years. You heard the story of Javad. That's 12 years. He's still going strong. So this is about someone with whom you can have the hard conversations. They might not trust you in the beginning, but you can see a path so that we tell each other what's going right and what's going wrong. Those are the guys that are going to make the change in the world that we need to see.
We have a chance for one more question. So
Why don't we take the two, since there have been after one? Why don't we take 1, 2, 3, and I'll try to answer all three in one.
I have two.
You didn't even have your hand up. Okay. Go ahead, go.
Okay, this is a little bit off topic, but we talked about leadership and we talked about courage, and we see a growing number of entrepreneurs growing in every organization, especially since CSR is so big nowadays. What is your advice for impact-driven leadership among entrepreneurs? And my second question is, could you give a little bit more on the relationship between accountability, sustainability, and impact, and how Acumen actually delivers that?
Okay, great. And why don't we take another? Yeah.
So I was reading the piece about that, and I was struck when you were talking about when you worked with the World Bank and you're trying to reconcile with the Gambian government about the $15 million program. And I was wondering, as the World Bank and the IMF have grown in influence over the past few years, who's come to play more of a dominant role in giving. And at the same time, we've seen more of a rise in impact investing and Gates Foundation and really trying to measure what philanthropy is doing. I wonder what your take was on the changing philanthropic industry and if it's moving towards a better model now and what the outlook is. the next 5-10 years.
Great. And one more, and I'll try to pull them on
I'll
together.
jump on the stage. It's really good to see UV alum on the stage, graduates here from Wahoo. My question is about any particular examples you have about human capital investments focus on that. I've heard a lot about technology, microfinance initiatives that Acumen's taking care of, but just wondering if there's any human capital-based projects around the world you guys have on play right now or in the pipeline, and also how can we, the Generation Y, sort of replicate that in our own little parts of the world.
Great. Okay, so. I got it. This entrepreneurial question is a really relevant question for today because, and it's really connected to the World Bank. And I'm going to connect it even if it's not, but it's, it actually is because the thing that is so astonishing to me is that the world actually is changing, and we hear terrible news every single day in the news. But if you look at Pakistan over the last 10 years, really great things have been happening, and all we look at is all the junk that makes us more cynical. If you look at corporations, it's really easy to point fingers at all the terrible things they're doing. But we have guys like Paul Pullman standing up in public and saying, I'm not giving you quarterly statements anymore, shareholders, and frankly, I want to run Unilever as a stakeholder company. That's enormous. That's totally different than anything that we've heard in a generation. And other companies are getting on the bandwagon. You see MasterCard saying, we want to help work toward a cashless society. I literally was recently in a conversation with an executive from a major company who said, didn't you say that if we have technologies and tools that can solve problems of poverty that we have a moral obligation to use them? And I said, yes, and I was literally like looking around the room like, is there a hidden camera here or something? And she said, well, why can't we work together and you can help build companies and maybe they don't have to be profitable. Maybe they just need to serve people. And so these are not conversations that we had with corporations 5 years ago, forget about 10 years ago. So for an entrepreneur, I would say, look around that company and find those people who actually have influence that you can then influence to take some risks, because I think you're going to find much more openness, particularly with companies that have supply chains that reach into markets that matter, and if human beings are involved, they all have markets that matter. And then build chapters within your companies. What's been so thrilling to me with seeing the Acumen chapters is that it's a way of bringing young professionals together to have these conversations. And one way to have courage is to have a posse. Because even if you have to raise money, sometimes you feel so humiliated and depressed that all you want to do is cry, but you really can't. But if you've got a posse, you can come home and you can laugh with each other and you can sometimes cry. And it just takes the hurt away and it gives you more courage to get out there. So find a posse. Because I feel really hopeful about what's happening more in corporations. The IMF and the World Bank is a little trickier because it is really hard to change these big institutions, particularly when they, at the governance level, have members of different high-level ministers sitting on the board making all the decisions. But Jim Kim at the World Bank is the real deal. He's really trying to focus on solving problems like poverty, and if we could get the bank to do more experiments, I think we'd really at least be able to show something. And so I do see change. USAID has done a guarantee with us to bring commercial banks to lend to companies that Acumen is involved with. They may be small again, but if you can make small big, people will really pay attention. And that would be my real advice to you. And then in terms of the generation, well, first, investments where we've had human capital. One that I feel particularly proud of, and it's often because of the brilliance of the team that I then learn once we get into these enterprises. It's a company called LaborNet, and it provides vocational training. When you hear about vocational training and you're my age, you kind of slump over and feel depressed. But again, it's all changing. So when Rana Plaza happened, and 1,200 people died in Bangladesh because of, frankly, immoral, the race to the bottom, which so many companies are forced to deal with. A lot of understanding started moving into the world that big companies subcontract to smaller companies that pay everybody in cash, so everything gets lost along the supply chain. Nobody really can pay attention to anything that's going on. Those companies can be on one thing and one thing only, cost. So people cut corners left and right, nobody pays for safety, nobody trains their workers. After Rana Plaza, a lot of the big corporates realized that they needed to find ways to train their employees at the very basic in safety. And so LaborNet happened to be a company that was already looking for ways to empower workers. And they now are starting to get many, many contracts. It's a really hard place they've got to be in. You talk about why they need patient capital, because they've got to go and convince subcontractors who don't necessarily have aligned interests that it matters to train their employees, construction workers, women who work in the leather canning industry in India, truly people who are the most marginalized. And what they've been doing is not only invest in safety and literacy and education, but they are finding the best of those workers in a country where 87% of the population does not graduate from 10th grade. And they're bringing them into more formal education programs. And so it's starting to teach us as Acumen and hopefully as a world that rather than just think about education in this single variable way again, where everybody goes into a school every day, if we can start to shift and look at alternative approaches to lifelong learning, whether it's with technology or whether it's vocational training or whether it's sitting people under a tree and using an accompaniment model, the world is open to us. And so in terms of what can your generation do, again, it's don't box yourself in to one way of thinking. Look at technology, look at the human side, invest in seeing what's out there, invest in each other, build communities where you take risks and you encourage each other to take risks. Because, like I said at the beginning, we have never needed you more. And the good news is, much more than to my generation, you have every tool technology in the world to make change. You can literally get up in the morning, decide to do it, and just go, not do it because you're going to fall 1,000 times as you go along, but to get on that path. So that's my answer to those 3 questions. I'll dig into it.
Thank you, Jacqueline. And once again, how about another hand for Jacqueline? Before we hand it up to Fordham, we wanted to quickly let you know about different ways of getting involved with the NY+Acumen chapter. While I won't list all of them right now, we have a few reps, a few chapter reps in the back of the room, on the side of the room, with name tags who can answer some questions. And if you're interested in donating to Acumen, you can also talk to these individuals. Thanks again for attending tonight. Now I'll turn it over to, I believe a couple of Fordham students wanted to make an announcement. Maybe that's not the case.
Okay. I wanted to thank Fordham personally for allowing us to be in this venue. Is Sarah Farouk still here? Sarah? Can you stand up if you're here? She might have left, but so Sarah's one of our volunteers, and she's also a student at Fordham. And she's the reason that we ended up connecting with this space, so I wanted to personally applaud her. I think she must have snuck out early. And I also want to thank all the Fordham students who came tonight. I really appreciate you guys attending. Thank you.
Can I also say thank you to the New York chapter. It's amazing when you see people self-organize and make change on behalf of an idea and a community. And New York is the first chapter. It has led the way, and you guys are just terrific and beyond inspirational. So thank you both, and thank all the people who make tonight happen and all the work that you do all the time.